So here's the Famicom, released in Japan in 1983, and because it was Nintendo's first home console with interchangeable cartridges, a lot of the parts are pretty much off the shelf, meaning they were standard components, including the screws. You're not going to see any specialty screws in the Famicom. On the outer shell here, and this is the back by the way, there are 6 standard Phillips head screws holding the console together. So I just used my standard medium-sized Phillips head screwdriver to open up the console. And I've already removed all 6 screws, and once you remove the bottom, you'll see the underside of the main board. And you'll also see the wires for the hardwired controllers that attach to the board here with these connectors. So what you're going to want to do to see a bit more of the innards of this console, you need to remove some other standard Phillips head screws. And we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I count 6 additional screws that are going to need to be removed. Something you may want to make note of when you're taking things apart, if any particular screw is set off by a color, like these 2 screws right here, these are to reinforce the cartridge loading slot. If we turn this over here, you can see their location matches up with the cartridge slot on the top side. That's to reinforce, to make sure that when users are pushing down on the cartridge that things stay intact and don't break. Typically, in reinforced areas like this, some of the screws may be bigger or longer, and you're going to want to make sure that those screws stay in their original position when you put them back. So let's get these additional screws taken out. Alright, so I've got all the additional internal screws taken out, and something that's kind of nice about the Famicom is the screws inside the system are identical to the screws on the outside of the system. So you really don't need to worry about which screw goes where when you're putting it back together. And it turns out that the screws in these blue parts here weren't longer to reinforce for their cartridge slot, but it is interesting to note that the mechanism for the eject slider, take a look at the eject slider on the top side of the console here. The little wedges that gradually push the cartridge up run right here underneath these blue parts. So this is an important area to definitely make sure you get the screws back in properly, because there's a lot of activity going around that area with the cartridge slot and with the eject mechanism. So given that the controllers are hardwired to this board, the best way to get it out is to lift it up from the top here. And there are a couple of plastic nubs going through holes in the PCB board here. And just kind of flip it forward. And you see the motherboard for the Famicom. And it is very small, if you take note there. That was one of the main goals that the then president back in 1983 of Nintendo Company Limited, Hiroshi Yamauchi, he wanted to produce this console at a profit. Typically, video game manufacturers lose money on the sales of their consoles, but they make their money back on the cartridges and game sales. That's typically known as the razor and blades model. But his decree or demand was that they make money not only on the cartridges, but also on the console. He originally wanted to have it set at a $75 price point. I'm not sure what that was in yen back at the time. But from what I understand, they weren't able to pull that off quite as cheaply as he would have liked. But the creator of the Famicom, or the designer rather, is Masayuki Uemura. He was able to come up with a design that was very cost effective for the Famicom. And you'll note that even though the Famicom was released in 1983, this particular model here has a copyright on the motherboard of 1989. So this is a little bit of a newer model of the Famicom. And it was based on a Motorola processor, the same one that was found in the one of the Atari consoles of the time. But a company called Ryko upgraded the processor to handle graphics, sound, and controller inputs here. So we take a look. There are several chips on the main board itself. Here we have, since it's a button, this is the reset button right here. And then the power switch is actually not mounted directly on the board itself. If you take a look coming off the side here, there's a red and a white wire, and that red and white wire goes to the switch that is actually mounted to the inside of the chassis right there. Here we have the external port for the beam gun, or the zapper as it was known in the United States. Here's the cartridge input, and here the shielded area is for the power input, the channel selectors, and the RF video output that also output the sound as well. So this board is very small. There isn't a whole lot to it. It actually stops when the shielded area starts, so you can get a sense of how simple this board actually is. And it's a little bit hard to maneuver these parts here since they're all joined together by wires. But if I can clear the way a little bit here, put the board down on my towel, you can see this whole slider mechanism here that's attached to the chassis by a spring. That is the eject mechanism for the cartridges. If you pull it up a little bit here, you'll see that this part is a wedge. And what that was designed to do is kind of slide underneath the cartridge as it was seated in the slot, and the further you slid the lever up, the more of the wedge pushed the cartridge up out of the slot for easy removal. Another curiosity with the original Famicom is the decision to hardwire the controllers to the unit itself. And this is where they connect right here to the front of the board. And it's I guess there are some technical reasons, the layout of the board, of why they had to be mounted to the front, because that just caused the unnecessary the cost of running wire the entire length of the console here to have them come out the back. Why they didn't just have the controller wires coming out the front right here, I'm not sure, but that was the decision. So the cartridge, or the controller wires, ran out the back, and then the controllers themselves were able to nest in these little slots right here. So this is the Famicom motherboard. Very simple and elegant in its design, and it achieved Hiroshi Yamauchi's goal of providing a very inexpensive yet quality video game experience. And it was so successful in Japan that he just knew, despite the video game problems in the United States, that a rebranded version, the Nintendo Entertainment System, would be successful. And he was definitely right. Let's take a look at the NES next. Keeping in mind that the Nintendo Entertainment System is essentially the exact same piece of hardware as the Famicom, you may ask yourself why it was to package the same motherboard in such a big console for the United States. Take a look at how small the Famicom console and its motherboard are, and how big the NES is in comparison. Well, kind of boggles the mind. I've discussed this in another video I made, I think it was in the Unbox series, that there were a few differences physically and electronically between the Famicom and the Nintendo Entertainment System. Some of them made this bigger form factor necessary, others really didn't. So the reason for the main overhaul of the cosmetic appearance of this system is because Nintendo wanted to market it more as a high-end piece of electronics rather than a toy. You take a look at the two consoles here. You've got the Famicom and the Nintendo Entertainment System. You ask yourself which one looks more like a toy. Well, you're going to say the Famicom. So they wanted to make it look more like a front-loading VCR that was very popular at the time. And in order to accomplish that, they needed this convoluted cartridge loading mechanism, which once we get this apart here, you're going to see that that comprises the bulk of this system's footprint right here. So those are some of the physical reasons for the difference. Another reason for a physical difference is because Nintendo wanted controllers that could be disconnected from the system up front. And the other difference is the security lockout known as the 10 NES chip. I'm going to actually show you those chips in the console and in the cartridge once we take those apart. Those were to kind of thwart piracy efforts that were running rampant with the Famicom because it did not have any such security implementation in place. So like the Famicom, the Nintendo Entertainment System is held together by 6 standard size Phillips screws. So I take my standard size Phillips screwdriver, take those all out, which I already have, and unlike the Famicom, once you pull the bottom off, all the internal components are in the bottom half, not in the top half like they were in the Famicom. So remove the top half, and we take a look at the inside of the Nintendo Entertainment System. And you're really greeted by a big RF shield. In the United States, the FCC has mandated a lot of regulations to control, video signals and interruptions and things like that. So a lot of RF shielding is necessary in the US versions of these products. So in order to see more of this console, we're going to have to remove this RF shield. And it's held on by a number of screws, but thankfully, like the Famicom, they're the same exact screws that were keeping the two pieces of the outer shell in place. So you really don't have to worry about what screw goes where, you just have to make sure you get all of them. And there are a few. There are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7 screws holding on the RF shielding. So let's get those taken out. So I got all 7 screws out of the RF shielding, and with that done, we should just lift up like so. And our view of the motherboard is still blocked, mainly by the cartridge loading mechanism. And this is what Nintendo wanted to implement as a big part of the overhaul to the NES. I think there were complaints about that it wasn't that easy to take cartridges out of the Atari 2600. So to alleviate that friction, Nintendo implemented this ZIF, or zero insertion force mechanism to put the games in and out. If you have never seen it before without the cover on, game just goes in like this. And even though the PCB board in the cartridge, the pins are in between the connector here, they still aren't making contact. The contact occurs when you push it down and the mechanism locks in place. And that's what causes problems over time. Once the cartridge is pushed down, those pins bend. And sometimes they bend out of position to where they're no longer making contact with the cartridge. And that's what causes you to get a blinking screen. So you need to reseat the cartridge. Or worst case scenario, you have to clean the whole thing. And a lot of what we did as kids was blow into the cartridge like so. I'm not actually going to do it, but you blew right in here, hoping to remove dust particles or whatever it was we thought was causing the interruption in the connection. But what that really did was it deposited moisture from your breath onto the contacts, which further caused corrosion and problems. So that really wasn't the best way to make it work. What you were really doing to make it work was reseating the game. You could just take it out, reseat it, maybe wiggle it around in there. There was a little bit of play inside the chamber here for the cartridge, and sometimes that would make it work. Worst case scenario, however, you would have to replace the 72-pin connector, which wasn't easy back then. Once you got the flashing screen, well, you probably needed to send in your Nintendo to have it repaired, which was one of the main reasons they put out the redesign with the top-loading cartridge interface. But anyway, let's see more of the motherboard for the Nintendo Entertainment System. And in order to do that, we're going to need to remove the zero insertion force loading mechanism here. And again, there are a number of screws holding it on. This time you are going to want to pay attention to which screws go where. There are a total of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 screws holding on this mechanism. You'll notice that 2 of those screws are actually silver in color. And they may even be a little longer. I can't remember off the top of my head, but we'll see in a moment here. So you want to make sure that these silver screws get put back in their position here. So let's get those taken out. Alright, after removing all 6 of those screws from the ZIF, or Zero Insertion Force cartridge mechanism, I did find that those 2 silver colored screws are slightly longer than the rest of the copper screws. So you definitely want to make sure that you get those back in their original position. Now there are two parts to this cartridge loading system here. The first is what I'm going to call the chamber, and basically it just sits on top of the board, and there's a hole cut out in the back so that this set of pins can go through it. And basically all you need to do is gently wiggle it back and forth, pull it forward, and then up so you can get it off of the board. You pull it forward. Not the easiest thing to do, but it does eventually come up. So you can see this is the mechanism right here. And as a side note, something you want to make sure that you do when you put it back together, if you take a look at the underside here, you'll notice this little lip of plastic right here. This lip of plastic must not sit on top of the board right here. It needs to kind of clip underneath. If it's sitting on top of the board, it's going to make it so that the top of the shell of the console does not sit properly on the bottom shell. So you do want to make sure that this lip goes underneath the board. Now the problem of the zero insertion force cartridge loading mechanism is this piece right here. You see all those 72 pins back there? This is where the cartridge is inserted, and over time, once the cartridge, if this is the 72 pin connector right here, the cartridge goes in, it's not making contact now. Once you push it down, then it begins to make contact with the pins, and those pins bend over time. This is the part that you can buy online. It only costs a couple dollars. It's not expensive at all. This is what you can replace altogether to make your Nintendo Entertainment System work just like it did when it was brand new. One of the side effects, however, is these replacement 72-pin connectors. They really are tight. You're going to notice it's hard to push the cartridge into it and hard to pull it out. But over time, of course, the pins will bend and that will become easier. So that's enough about the loading system here, which was the main difference between the NES and the Famicom. Another difference is the 10 NES chip, which was a security chip. Nintendo didn't want people, or manufacturers rather, who were not licensed to make games, making games. So there's a chip on this motherboard, and there's a chip in each licensed Nintendo Entertainment System cartridge. And once you turn the system on, the first thing that the system will do is have those two chips communicate. And if they're authentic, if it's a licensed game, the game will boot up. If it's not, you'll get that flashing screen. That same screen that you get when there is a dirty connection here. So that was a common problem. So a lot of times, even though you were using a licensed game, you'd get the flashing screen just because it was dirty or because the pins were bent. So this was a very finicky loading system. Let's locate that 10 NES chip on the board here. Unfortunately, what we're looking at is the bottom of the motherboard, and that means we're going to have to continue to take the console apart even further here. This board right here is the main board. It's rectangular, just like the Famicom motherboard. The only difference is that there is this shielded area kind of coming off to the corner here. You remember, if we compare it with the Famicom, you can see the definite difference in sizes of the motherboards. The shielded area where the audio and video out is on the back. Here on the NES, it's kind of on the corner. And in order to continue to get the board out of the bottom half of the shell, we're going to have to remove this screw as well, and this screw right here. There are two screws holding in the shielded area. So let's get those out. Okay, I got those two screws out, and for all intents and purposes, the motherboard is now free. However, we're going to take one additional piece off to make our lives easier, and that is this little bezel right here that is holding the controller ports. And these two screws that are holding it on are a little bit different than the other screws that we've taken out so far. They look very different, and they will not fit anywhere else but here. I'm using my jeweler's screwdriver, or my precision screwdriver. It's a very small Phillips screwdriver to take these out. So you just remove those screws from the other underside of the console, and now this little bezel will flip up. And the reason I wanted to do that is I wanted to have a little bit more flexibility in what I can do with these wires, because these wires really do limit your movement with the board. You'll notice that there is even more RF shielding on the bottom. Like I said, due to the FCC regulations, there was a lot of shielding necessary here. So it's even on the bottom. This whole system is encased in shielding. And in order to get the shield off, you're going to have to disconnect the power and reset button connector right here. This cord right here runs to the power and reset button. So these big plugs can be a bit tricky to get off. They aren't difficult, they're just a tight connection a lot of times. So I like to put it down here. If I can wiggle it back and forth, there we go. That didn't come off with much difficulty. So we flip it back over. Now hopefully the shielding will drop down. Nope, not going to drop down. And that's because, guess, we also need to disconnect the controller ports here. So again, these are green ones. You're going to want to note that the controller 1 port is on the back side of the motherboard, and the controller 2 port is on the side of the motherboard. Again, you just wiggle them back and forth to disconnect them. Now, this piece of shielding should lift right off, like so. And the first thing you're going to notice is that there is a piece to this console that, if you're familiar with it, is going to look different. This is the EXT port that was included on the system but never used. There was a disk system peripheral in Japan for the Famicom, and I think the thought was, if it were ever released in the United States, the Nintendo Entertainment System would sit right on top of it and interface with it through this port. So in my other videos, I've shown that this is the port cover. You remove the port cover, break off this piece of plastic, and that would then expose this port right here, but it was never used. Getting back to the 72-pin connector, this is the part that causes the problem, and it's got a rather tight fit, but in order to get it off, all you need to do is wiggle back and forth, and it comes off like so. This is the part that plugs into the motherboard. This is the part that plugs into the cartridge here. And these you can buy on Amazon or on eBay rather inexpensively. And you'll notice that I'm manhandling this this motherboard. I have washed my hands very well. I've actually washed my hands several times during the shooting of these videos. And I would recommend that if you want to go so far as to wear gloves, that might not be a bad idea. But a lot of times oils from your hands can get on the metal parts and cause problems down the line. So I've probably washed my hands about 3 or 4 times already. So just make sure that you handle the electronics carefully. So this is our motherboard. Going to take a look for that 10 NES chip that is the source of the flashing screen problem a lot of times if you have a bad connection, or if the game that you're using is not licensed and does not have the 10 NES chip counterpart. So if we take a closer little look, here's the bugger right there. That's the 10 NES chip. And if we compare this board to the Famicom board, or at least the underside of the Famicom board, there are several other chips on this motherboard than there were on the Famicom. And to be honest with you, I don't know why there's such a difference in the motherboards, because for all intents and purposes, the NES is the same piece of hardware as the Famicom. The only main difference is the loading system, the breakaway controllers, and the 10 NES chip to prevent piracy. But the 10 NES chip is nothing by itself. It needs its counterpart inside the actual cartridge that you're going to be playing. So we're going to take a look at some cartridges too, for both the NES and the Famicom. Okay, we're going to take a look at two games here. This is Robot Block for the Famicom. This is one of the two robot games. And this is Stack Up for the Nintendo Entertainment System. For all intents and purposes, these are the same game, just a different name in whatever region they were for. Now this is a typical Famicom cartridge, and if you take a look at it, you're going to notice that there aren't any screws anywhere to be found. And that is why I am not going to take this cartridge apart. I've seen some videos on YouTube of people doing so, and they use clamps, they pry screwdrivers in between the two pieces, and that's not for me. I would like to keep my cartridges in as good of condition as possible. But the good news is that due to a curiosity with the US version of Stack Up, we can see this exact same board that's in the Japanese version by taking apart the US version. This is one of the earliest Nintendo Entertainment System games. It's one of the two for the robot, like I said. It's also a black box game. The 30 black box games had a black starry field background here, and then they had pixel art as the box art. And because it's one of the first release games, it's also known as a 5-screw cartridge. You take a look here on the front, we're going to compare it to a newer game. I've got Super Mario Bros. 3 here. You'll notice that Super Mario Bros. 3 has 2 clips on the front here. Stack Up does not. Super Mario Bros. 3 also has 3 screw holes. Stack Up has 5 screw holes. So I think somewhere down the line, Nintendo decided to save some money on manufacturing costs and screws and went to 2 plastic clips in the front, thus reducing the number of screws that it needs for each cartridge. Now, early Nintendo Entertainment System games used a very interesting, very small type of flathead screw. And given the lighting that I have here, there's clouds in the sky today, I keep losing my light. I don't know if it's going to focus on that or not, but if you can't see that, that is a very small flathead screw. You can use any small flathead screwdriver that you have to take those out, and I've already done so. If we remove the back cover here, we're going to see something that is not typical in an NES cartridge. This is one of the rare adapter cartridges. And it's an adapter cartridge because, and by the way, the adapter was held in with 2 screws at these 2 points right here. I've already removed those. The adapter cartridges have this black adapter inside of it. And the reason for that is that for whatever reason, Nintendo decided to, when they shipped this Stack Up game in the United States, they made no changes from the Japanese version whatsoever. As a matter of fact, when you boot up this US copy of Stack Up, you get the Robot Block title screen of the Japanese game, because it is the Japanese game. This board right here is a board for the Japanese Famicom. And like I said, I've washed my hands. You want to make sure you do that when you're handling electronics. All you do is remove the board from the adapter, and this is the exact same 60-pin board that is inside this cartridge here. And it was put in this adapter, which is a 72-pin NES adapter, so that it will play. And in order for it to play, it also has the 10 NES chip that was not necessary on this board to communicate with the Famicom. So, I'm not sure which games had this format, this adapter format, but I know that Stack Up is one of them. So, these adapters are not in all US Nintendo Entertainment System games. Only in a select few where no changes to the Japanese version were made. Going to move a couple years into the future here. 1985 to 1987, we'll take a look at The Legend of Zelda. And the reason why I want to take a look at that is because The Legend of Zelda is one of the battery backup cartridges. Back then, in order to save your games, you didn't use memory cards. there was a battery inside the cartridge that did the job for you. Now this battery, unfortunately, like any battery, will lose its charge over time. But believe it or not, and this is one of the first versions of The Legend of Zelda. You can tell because it has 5 screws. Most copies of The Legend of Zelda are the 3-screw cart. But this one's the 5-screw version. And this battery still works. I still have a save game on this, and it works just fine. So, take off the back. You see this board is a little bit bigger than the stack-up board. And that, of course, is to accommodate the bigger game. The Legend of Zelda was a much bigger game than stack-up. And then there's the battery that saves your progress. And something else that any kid growing up 1987 through now knows is that in order to protect your save game information on The Legend of Zelda, you can't just turn the power off. Once you save, if you're done, you have to hold in the reset button on the console. I'm going to demonstrate this. A little bit of NES culture for you. So you've just saved your game in The Legend of Zelda. You have to hold down the reset button, and then push the power button. And then that will prevent data erasure. Why that was necessary, I don't know. I think maybe when you released the power button, there was some sort of power spike that caused some problem with the battery and it lost your game save. You could save again, it didn't ruin the battery, but it would just wipe your data save, unfortunately. And it's interesting because there were a couple software revisions to versions of The Legend of Zelda. The very early ones, this one included, because this is one of the launch versions of The Legend of Zelda with the 5 screws, did not have a little disclaimer on the save screen. There was a little box in newer versions that would pop up on the screen saying, make sure you hold in the reset button while you're turning the power off to avoid loss of data. So that's The Legend of Zelda. And then the final game I'm going to take a look at is Super Mario Bros. 3. This is a later game. It was released in 1990 in the United States. And as a later game, it's a 3-screw version. But the screws are different. They aren't those mini flathead screws that we saw in The Legend of Zelda and Stack-Up. What they are, instead, are those 3.8 millimeter game bits. And I don't know if my camera's going to focus on that, but you do need your 3.8 millimeter game bit to screw and unscrew these little pieces here. And this was the first time that we saw Nintendo start to use game bits instead of standard screws. And that was a lot more of a lockout back in the 80s when it wasn't so easy to come across screwdrivers because of online sales. So I took the 3 security bits out, and we take a look at Super Mario Brothers. Super Mario Bros. 3, that is. And it's a bigger cartridge, not because it has a battery save, but just because it's a more advanced Nintendo Entertainment System game. The sound, the graphics, if you compare the music and the graphics to from Super Mario Bros. 3 to the original Super Mario Bros., you can see why they would have needed additional memory. Plus, the game's bigger. More power-ups, more suits, more levels. Means more information, means the necessity for larger chips. So, Nintendo Entertainment System cartridges and Famicom cartridges did come in varying sizes. One variation I noticed, it seems the newer games also have this gap in the pins. Remember the other games we looked at? Take a look at Legend of Zelda again. There's no gap in the pins there, and I don't know why that is. I'm not even sure how many are missing. It'd be interesting if it reduced the 72 pins down to 60, which is the same as the Famicom. So I hope you've enjoyed part 1 of Nintendo Torn Down. In part 2, we're going to be keeping the Famicom and the NES in mind as we tear down the redesigns for both of those systems.